Hello again. Let's talk about the concept of photosynthesis. Take the name apart for a moment and think about what it's saying. It's saying that light energy is used somehow, photo. And what's going to be the ultimate result of this process? The synthesis of some kind of molecule. Put simply, we're using light energy to power the production of organic molecules, carbohydrates in general. Okay? So photosynthesis is a process of using what? Raw materials, raw inorganic materials, things like CO2 and water. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to build or make carbohydrates. So I'm going to actually take those carbons and somehow link them together in a chain. I'm going to take those hydrogens from the water and hook them onto the carbon chain to make a carbohydrate. Remember, a carbohydrate like glucose, C6H12O6, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. So I'm going to have to take inorganic raw materials and put them together to make that organic molecule. We could think of this as a organism using light energy to power the production of its food molecules, its nutrient molecules. And when we think about something like a plant, a typical photoautotroph, we're thinking about an organism that can make all of its organic molecules with the simple carbohydrate it's going to make from this process of photosynthesis. And by that I mean that it makes all of its lipids, its amino acids, its nucleotides, and its other carbohydrates, all from this basic starting point, the product of this process called photosynthesis. These type of organisms, as the name tells us, are photoautotrophs. Now there is another related kind of food production process, but it's something that's very uncommon to us. We tend not to think about it too much, and it doesn't happen in the environments that we typically are found in. It's a process that's referred to as chemosynthesis, where instead of light energy being used, energy in the form of high temperature chemicals are used to drive the process of synthesis. Still, there has to be an energy source, and so now we're talking about a chemical energy source. And the organisms are doing basically the same thing. They're taking inorganic raw materials and building their own organic molecules. These would be organisms that we'd call chemo autotrophs. We find these kinds of organisms in the hydrothermal vents, the hot water vents at the bottom of the ocean. Sometimes they're in superheated waters of springs, like up in the Jemez Mountains here in New Mexico. They might also be found in places like Yellowstone, in the hot springs there. So these are organisms that are still doing a synthesis process, but they're starting out with a different energy source, a high temperature chemical energy source instead of light energy. Now, this overview of photosynthesis gives you the basic idea of what we're going to be doing. Notice that what we're saying is that we're starting out with our basic raw materials, carbon dioxide and water. We're adding light energy, and we're going to be making carbohydrates like glucose. And also we're going to be releasing as a byproduct oxygen gas. Now realize that oxygen gas release is tied to the use of water. And you might want to go back and remind yourself about the different types of photolysis to remind yourself that some organisms don't release oxygen as a byproduct. We're just going to take a look at oxygenic, right? Oxygenic photosynthesis. Photosynthesis with oxygen as one of the byproducts, okay? Now, autotrophs are also called producers. What we mean by that is that, well, an organism like myself, like you, we're heterotrophs. We're consumers. We have to consume autotrophs, or we have to consume other organisms that have eaten autotrophs. When I eat a cow, what I'm really doing is I'm eating energy stored in molecules that originally came from a plant. And that energy to make those molecules originally came from sunlight. So that means that all the food molecules I consume as a heterotroph have come from these autotroph producers. So what are we talking about? Well, primarily from our perspective, it's plants. But it also could be some of the protists, like some of the algae. It also can be some of the bacteria and some of the archaea. So there's a number of organisms that are photosynthetic autotrophs, or photoautotrophs. They're the ultimate producers. They're the primary producers of virtually all the food utilized on the planet. That's why some people argue that this process of photosynthesis is the most important chemical event that occurs. Every bit of nutrients that you take in, you could trace back to a light source. You could trace it back to a photosynthetic process. So even if I'm eating a cow, or I'm eating a mushroom, or I'm eating virtually any kind of food, if I think about it, I can ultimately trace it back to some kind of autotroph producer that originally took light energy and converted it into stored chemical energy. Take a moment to consider that and think about it. Look at those different food items you consume and consider where the energy in those bonds, in those organic molecules, how did it get there? Where did it come from? Now, bacteria and archaea also have organisms, members of those groups, that are chemosynthetic, and they can be important for some food chains, some food webs, some ecosystems around the planet. But remember where I mentioned those are located. I expect to find those kinds of organisms in the bottom of the ocean, in hot springs, in the center of Mount St. Helens when it blew up. And people went up there and first started to study those hot waters left in the center of that volcano. Guess what they found? Chemo Autotrophs. Organisms using heat energy to drive their process of chemosynthesis. Now, we don't rely on that as our nutrient source, but there are some organisms that's their primary energy source. And when we look at some of the communities around the hydrothermal vents at the bottom of the ocean, they're complex, they're rich. There's crabs, there's worms, there's shrimp. There's all kinds of organisms that base their entire food chain on chemosynthesis. So it can be important for some organisms. On a global scale, though, it's far less important than photosynthesis. On land, what do we have doing most of the photosynthesis? Well, they're the things we call plants, aren't they? A variety of kinds of things, grasses, trees, cacti, all kinds of organisms that are classified collectively as plants. In aquatic environments, what kind of things do we have? The protist group called the algae. Organisms that might be called cyanobacteria, those are called blue-green algae. There might also be just bacteria making up a key component of the photosynthetic producers found in aquatic environments. Worldwide, those tiny organisms that float in the surface of the ocean produce far more food materials than all the land plants collectively. So it can be a very important source of food for aquatic environments. So what is photosynthesis? In a very general sense, it's another kind of redox reaction. Water molecules are split apart. Remember, we called that photolysis. And the electrons and the hydrogen ions are removed, leaving oxygen gas, if we're doing oxygenic photophosphorylation, right? Those electrons and the hydrogen ions are transferred to CO2, along with some hydrogen atoms, right? Think about that. Electrons and hydrogen ions, hydrogen atoms, transferred to the CO2, and the result is we produce a carbohydrate. So look at this basic simplified version of this chemical reaction. Carbon dioxide, water. What do I produce? Carbohydrates. Water, oxygen, byproducts of the process. Photosynthesis. Notice what we're saying. CO2 is reduced or experiences reduction to become the carbohydrate. Water, right, is oxidized as its hydrogens are pulled off to become the oxygen that's released as a byproduct. Make sure you compare that with, contrast it with respiration. Probably what you're going to see is they're the reverse of each other, aren't they? The molecules that were built during photosynthesis are taken apart during respiration. The light energy that was put into this process to drive the production of the carbohydrates is released and escapes as either heat energy or is used to build ATPs. So respiration and photosynthesis can be thought of as being the reverse of each other. And you can see how these then would be tied to each other in terms of the environment, the ecosystem. Organisms that are doing photosynthesis are making carbohydrates and oxygen. Organisms that are carrying out respiration are using up carbohydrates and oxygen, but they're releasing CO2. Well, the autotrophs need the CO2 plus the light energy to start the process again. You can see how they can be tied together in an ecological sense. Also, one thing for you to keep in mind, and I don't want you to think that plants, for example, autotrophs, only do photosynthesis. Every plant outside your door is doing both photosynthesis, making organic molecules, and then in other locations within that same cell, right? Photosynthesis in the chloroplast. In the mitochondria of that cell, they're doing respiration. So don't think of plants as only doing photosynthesis. They still do respiration just like you do. Of course, we as animals, we as heterotrophs, only do respiration. We can't carry out any kind of photosynthetic process. Make sure you compare those two. See how they're the reverse of each other. All right, so what have we been talking about? We're saying that photosynthesis is this process that we could break down into two stages. The thing that links them together are the ATPs and the NADPHs made by the first half of the process that then are utilized by the second half of the process. The complete process of photosynthesis has two major subcomponents. One's called the light reactions, better to call them the light-dependent reactions, and the other part is called the Calvin cycle. By the way, sometimes you'll see the Calvin cycle called the dark reactions, which really isn't a good name because that implies that they only happen in the dark. Better to call the Calvin cycle, or the second half of photosynthesis, the light-independent reactions. So the light reactions do what? Well, that's that photophosphorylation we've already talked about. Light energy is absorbed, excited electrons are produced, ATPs get made by chemiosmosis, and finally we produce NADPHs as one of the products. Also, by the way, I might release oxygen gas as part of that event. In the Calvin cycle, I'm going to do what? I'm going to take the energy from the ATPs I've made already. I'm going to take the hydrogens from the NADPHs that I've made in this photophosphorylation event, and I'm going to use those along with some CO2 I have to take in from the atmosphere in this process called the Calvin cycle. So the Calvin cycle is going to use energy from ATP, hydrogen from NADPH, CO2 from the atmosphere, and in a series of chemical steps build a carbohydrate. As a matter of fact, what it builds is G3P, phosphoglyceraldehyde. You might remember that name because it was a name we talked about when we were doing glycolysis. So it makes one of the key carbohydrate building blocks to make all kinds of other molecules. All right, so let's consider what we've looked at here. We said that we were talking about organisms that are producers, synthetic organisms, right? Different types of autotrophs, photoautotrophs, and we even mentioned briefly the chemo autotrophs. We said that the process of photosynthesis could be broken down into two components, the light-dependent reactions, and that's something we've talked about in some fair amount of detail, photophosphorylation, making ATPs and NADPHs to power and provide the hydrogens for the second part of photosynthesis, the light-independent reactions, or sometimes called the Calvin cycle. That's where the CO2, ATPs, NADPHs together are used to produce the organic molecule, the final product, the starting point of the synthesis of all the other organic molecules made by an autotroph. And then finally, just to remind you, we have organisms that are photoautotrophs as well as organisms that are chemoautotrophs. And the difference is in terms of what their initial energy source is to drive the synthetic process. All right, well, thanks very much for considering this. Notice we haven't really gone into all the detail that's available when you take a look at your textbook, for example. This level of detail is all I really want you to know about photosynthesis. Please don't focus on any of the individual steps or the variations in the Calvin cycle. Just have a general idea about it. All right? Thanks very much. Look forward to talking to you next time.